I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Okay. So welcome everyone to our second Sonic speaker. Today we welcome Michael Siciliano from the University of Illinois, just down this road here at Chicago. Professor Siciliano is an assistant professor of public administration. His research interests are span multiple disciplines, and including policy and administration and the implications of human and organizational networks. He's done research on education, disaster response, and some network methodology. So this year, regrets that he can't be here physically, but he is up here virtually in the front row. So let's all welcome Michael Siciliano.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Ashir. It's a pleasure to be here at Sonic Lab in Northwestern, where so much great network research and thinking has occurred. And it's a privilege to share with you some of the recent work that I've been doing with some collaborators, thinking about, in particular, sort of science collaboration networks. And what we've been particularly focused on is how there have been changes in the way that these networks are governed, particularly from institutional frameworks. And so the material that scientists collect and that they use, particularly genetic material that they need for their research, has come under increasingly number of constraints. There are growing institutional regulations at the international level and the national level that constrain the access and exchange of these genetic and biological materials. And so as our science has grown global, we have collaborators across different continents trying to deal with issues of nutrition, piracy, dealing with crop sustainability, pest resistance. We need a wide range of diverse genetic resources in order to create these innovations, to create these discoveries, and it requires us to build networks that have these collaborations associated with them. So in comes these global regulatory regimes that are constraining the flow and access of scientists' ability to obtain these materials, right? So within this context that I kind of want to talk about today, right? And so really this kind of hits on three different areas, both from a policy angle and from a theoretical angle, and that's thinking about the way in which these institutions shape individuals' choices, right? And how those choices then affect the types of networks and the collaborative structures that they become embedded in. And so really this talk will kind of unfold in three different parts. The first part is going to look more broadly at science collaboration networks, sort of outside the realm of genetic resource exchange, which will be the kind of focus of the second two parts. And really it's going to look at how these networks are structured, how they form, how they evolve, and what are the implications of those changes in this network structure for the type of science productions that these scientists are able to produce, the outputs that they produce from their work. The second part will bring in this idea of this contested resource framework, and we call it contested resources simply because there are a variety of constraints and actors that place rules and regulations and restrictions on genetic material exchange. It's not simply within the control of the individual scientists. And I'll give you some more qualitative examples of the type of strategic responses that these scientists have engaged in trying to deal with this new contested resource framework, these new sort of institutional rules and regulations. And then lastly, we'll kind of combine those worlds together to try to understand how scientists are thinking about dissolving, forming, and persisting different ties within their networks when they're faced with these constraints from the environment. This is some data that we actually just finished collecting a few months ago. And so, why don't we begin with this sort of myth of science production, right? This idea that you have this sort of lone genius who comes up in a moment of sheer brilliance, some very innovative design or some groundbreaking discovery, right? And this idea of the sort of lone scientist is popularized all throughout our culture, right? They're thinking about movies such as The Beautiful Mind with John Nash, or there's the more recent one with Stephen Hawking, I think A Theory of Everything, right? We have this belief that these individuals are operating alone, right? If you read work about Einstein, he didn't come up with the theory of relativity as he was sitting in the patent office in Bern, right? This thing was evolved over a period of time, and it became more refined as he moved up the ranks of academic institutions in Europe. He actually refers to the individuals as the sounding boards that he needed to help refine this particular theory, right? So this idea of the lone genius is a myth, and especially in this modern age of global science, if we really want to understand how science is being produced and how it's being done, we need to understand the types of networks that these scientists embed themselves in, who their collaborators are, and the resources that they're able to obtain and exchange through these particular networks. Right? And so that idea in itself is absolutely nothing new, right? There's, for decades, have been research looking into the connection between collaboration and productivity in science, right? And there's this burgeoning field of work on team science. There's conferences now on the science of team science. We're trying to better understand how these teams can be composed and they can be arranged in ways that allow them to be more productive and more innovative. But this relationship between collaboration at a team level or among a group of scientists and individual productivity is a little bit more complex. It's a little bit less well understood. There's actually research that is coming out that suggests collaboration leads to both more and less productivity, right? Obviously, there are contingencies here, and it depends on a variety of factors. And most importantly, and obviously, these networks are not static, right? We are constantly changing who we interact with, who we collaborate with, and aspects of how we shape and reshape our networks are going to be really important for thinking about our productivity, right? And in thinking about sort of network change and network structure, I like to think about this in terms of this concept of network churn, right? And just as a bit of a way of a motivating example about how this can be important, here are two networks. These are some schools that I work with, and these networks were collected on the same set of teachers roughly, I think, 2 or 3 months apart, right? You can tell the density is nearly identical. The actors that are central in these networks are the same. The ones on the periphery are the same. And what you miss simply by looking at these networks from this topological view, we assume that not much has actually occurred in these networks over this 3-month span, but really over 92 ties have either turned on or off within just those 3 months. So there's a ton of churning that goes on within inside of our networks that we're going to miss simply from a topological view, looking at their size or their density, right? And so this concept of network churn is more than just a simple addition or dissolution of ties, right? It's really thinking about the composition and the membership of the individuals that are in my networks, and how when I begin to form new connections or disengage from previous ones, how that shapes the composition and the structure of my overall network, right? And so churn operates at both this dyadic level, right, where you can think about tie formation. Why are certain ties forming to certain particular alters? You can think about tie persistence at the dyadic level. Why are some stickier than others? Why do I maintain some ties over time and not others? And then you think about the loss of ties. Why do I dissolve these particular ties and not other ones? And not just this tie formation and dissolution, but also the change in the composition of those ties, right? So if you're me, maybe I hang around with a bunch of people who do policy and administration work, but eventually over time I start bringing in other actors who are involved in computer science or engineering, right? So how is the composition of those ties changing as well? You can think about this at the network level, right? The change in the overall size of my network. Is it shrinking? Is it growing? And what about the overall composition of my network? Something like an EI index, right? How is the external versus internal aspects of my networks when thinking about the attributions of my peers changing as well, right? So we think about network churning as these sort of changes both at the dyadic level and the network level. And so in that realm, we were sort of wondering, well, how do scientist networks change over time, right? How many ties are losing? How many ties are they adding? What are these different sort of ways in which scientist networks may be evolving, and how does that change affect their productivity over time? And so we really wanted to begin trying to come up with a theory or a reason why scientists might pursue different paths, right? Pursue different ways of churning their networks or evolving their particular networks. And so we turned to some of the classic literature on organizations by James March, looking at these sort of two ways that firms sometimes interact in their environment, through an exploration process and an exploitation process, right? And so the exploration process is really sort of reaching out to new peers, to new alters, to new ideas, right? Bringing in people that weren't connected to your network previously, right? And this is often thought both in terms of organizations and individuals as a more risky long-term play, right? There's uncertainty when you bring new people into your networks. There are coordination costs about how you're going to engage those individuals. There are transactions costs about how you're going to interact, or you're going to segment your different work processes. Right? So exploration, because it's a little bit more uncertain, it has that risk associated with it, but the benefit of an exploratory process is you're reaching out to new people, new ideas. You might be more innovative, right? All the reasons why Ron Burt sort of promotes structural holes as sort of access to these good ideas, right? An exploitation process you can think of one as where you're focused on maintaining your existing set of ties, right? You're going to focus on known factors, on known resources, on known information, right? And because of that, your increase in knowledge and innovativeness might only be sort of marginal, right? We're maintaining ourselves within a particular structure that we have known, right? And so these are two different ways on a continuum of which people may think about sort of churning or evolving their particular networks. And you may engage in different ones at different courses in time throughout your particular career, right? And our hypothesis is simply that if you engage in this exploration process, right, some of the telltale signs of that is, hey, you're going to be adding a whole bunch of new ties to your network. You're probably going to be losing a bunch of ties given the cost and time requirements required to hold those particular ties. And because we're reaching out to new individuals and bringing in folks that weren't part of our original network, likely the density of our network is going to decrease, right? And because of these things, you might see a decrease in your quantity of outputs. And we're talking about quantity here in terms of sort of publications or grant applications, right? These things that are outputs of the scientific process, right? And again, the reason is when I bring in these new individuals, there are coordination costs, there are transaction costs to getting going and getting started again. But because we're bringing in these new individuals with potentially new and innovative ideas, it holds promise that we could increase the quality of our work, right? It might be more innovative in the long term. And exploitation looks a lot different, right? What are the telltale signs of someone engaged in an exploitation process? Well, your ties are going to be more sticky. There'll be fewer new ties. There'll be less ties that you dissolve. Because these individuals you are maintaining within your network, likely that density is going to increase. And because of that, you might increase the quantity of your output, right? The quantity of your publications. Because again, you're working within known processes, with known skills, with known resources, and it's easier to coordinate and interact with those individuals. But again, it holds the promise of perhaps only marginal or incremental increases in the knowledge base or the innovativeness of the work that you are conducting, right? So there's sort of costs and benefits to both of these particular strategies. And so some of the ideas or some of the advice we often give, especially to junior scientists about, well, just go explore, build your networks, that may not be the best advice for everyone at all times, and it might not be the best advice for science moving forward. And so these are the first three hypotheses are just about that, right? How new ties and lost ties are going to affect the production quantity and quality of our work. We also wanted to look at instrumental ties. So as you bring in these new individuals into your network over time, do they have skills and expertise that you don't hold, or are these people who just kind of run in your same circles, right? And the idea being if we can bring in these other individuals with skills and knowledge that we don't currently possess to our collaborative network, that's going to help us become more productive. But also, we should consider our ability to understand the expertise of those individuals that we are bringing in. This kind of concept of absorptive capacity, right? Do we have the ability to integrate their knowledge and skills within our team? And if we understand something about their expertise and their knowledge, it's going to be easier for us to be able to do that, right? So can we integrate these diverse skills that we are bringing in ways that are effective? And then lastly, regardless of what sort of strategy scientists are pursuing, whether they're trying to gain additional resources from their existing network or they're branching out to others, to new individuals, the idea is, and the goal is to try to bring in additional resources, right? Additional collaborative capacity. And you can do that through both of those particular strategies. And one of the things that we measure is sort of the existence of collaborative capacity within a scientist network. And regardless of what strategy they were pursuing, we assume that that's going to lead to some sort of increase in quantity and quality of their work. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the data that we tested this with. We had 2 waves of a national survey of scientists across 6 different fields of science. There was in electrical engineering, physics, chemistry, biology, earth and atmospheric sciences, and computer sciences. And we collected this data from individuals at all 149 Carnegie Research universities in the US. Okay, we created this sort of large database of scientists based on departmental websites. There were roughly 24,000 scientists who worked at these institutions in those 6 different fields. And we took a stratified samples of those individuals based on gender, academic position, meaning their rank, and the field in which they worked in. Okay? Some of this work was really interested in the role of gender in science, and so that's one of the reasons why we stratified the sample on gender. We had about 1,600 surveys were completed at this first time point, and to everyone who completed that survey at the first time point, we sent them a follow-up survey 2 to 2.5 years later, and got about 700 responses to that particular follow-up survey. And these surveys asked them a lot of questions about their closest collaborators, their advice providers, who they got particular resources from, their productivity, and a whole bunch of other questions about these individual scientists. And we had two types of dependent variables. The first, as I mentioned, was this idea of quantity. Again, these are just outputs of the scientific process. How many publications did you produce, and how many grants did you submit, right? So this tells something about how productive you are, but it doesn't really say anything about the quality or the innovativeness of the work that you were doing. And for that, we kind of used a proxy, not the greatest proxy in the world, but we were thinking about measuring quality by the number of grants that actually received funding and the total dollar amount of the grants, of those successful grants that you obtain. Right? Thinking about that these grant-making processes are rather competitive. They're often given to individuals because their proposals hold promise to be produce innovations, to produce important discoveries. And so as we're thinking about how these networks are evolving and churning, we're thinking about how they impact these different indicators of quantity and quality. And so in the models that we build, we're actually able to control for the previous quantity and quality of that scientist's work, right? So these lag-dependent variable models. And so really what we're doing is we're controlling for how productive that scientist was at the initial time point, how their networks were structured at that initial time point, and then asking how do these changes in the structure and composition of their networks affect their productivity at that second time point. Okay. The independent variables we go through are just this lost ties. Well, how many ties were present at the first time point, but not there at the second time point? New ties, how many ties are present at time point 2, but not at time point 1? Again, this idea of instrumental ties, we asked the respondents for every new tie that they had mentioned at the second time point, does this individual provide methodological or theoretical expertise that you currently do not have? And for all those individuals, we also asked them, or recognizing that you interact with people who have different areas of specialization, indicate the extent to which you understand their area of expertise, right? Again, just thinking about this concept of absorptive capacity. And then resource availability, right? This is an average measure of the number of sort of collaborative activities, resources available to EGO through their alters, okay? And the way that we were able to capture lost ties and new ties, we actually piped in all of the alters that were named at the first time point survey into that second survey, and we asked the respondent, do you still interact with all these particular individuals, right? And so we didn't risk the chance that they just simply forgot to name them. We actually piped all of those alters in to give them a chance to indicate whether or not they continue to have interactions and collaborations with those individuals. So just give you a sense of how much is actually happening here, right? And this sort of bifurcation of exploitation and exploration, you can see for some of our scientists, they lost no ties. They maintained every single tie that was in their network, and others lost up to 15 of their previous collaborators. Again, these are individuals that they said they collaborated at time point 1, we showed them to them at time point 2, and they said that I'm no longer working with 15 of these individuals. In terms of new ties, some people are not forming any new ties, others are bringing in up to 11 individuals into their collaboration networks. You can see, again, because of those numbers, right, some network sizes were decreasing drastically, shrinking by as many as 13 people, and some were growing by as many as 11. And the density was the same. Some networks went from almost completely closed to completely open, and others went in reverse. So the structures of these networks are varying drastically over time. And their ability to bring in collaborative resources changed. Some were bringing in many more collaborative resources, and others, that value was dropping drastically. So to give you a sense of this sort of distribution, right, the average person was bringing on about 3 to 4 new ties, but there were a whole bunch of individuals who weren't adding any new ties at all, and out here in the sort of right tail, again, those folks bringing on 8, 9, 10, 11 new actors into their network, sort of the sign of this really explorative strategy here. And roughly kind of similar distribution, a little bit more of a longer tail here for the number of lost ties, right? But again, the average here is around 3 to 4 ties that are being lost between those two time points. Some not losing any, and others losing quite a large amount. So what do we find through this lag-dependent variable model, right? So as theory would suggest, what we found is that these exploration strategies, the ones that are adding these new ties, that are shedding existing ties, right, simultaneously boosted the number of grant dollars that these scientists were receiving, but it hurt their publications. Right? We saw the quality perhaps improving, but the quantity of that scientific output was dropping. The reverse for the exploitation strategy. For those scientists who were maintaining ties, they saw gains in productivity. Right? Again, perhaps for reasons because they already know how to work within these processes. They know how to integrate the individuals within their network. They know how to work together effectively. But it did hurt the innovativeness of their future research. They had less successful grant applications. They brought in fewer dollars. Right? So these two strategies do have significant real-world implications in terms of science output. In terms of instrumental ties, bringing in folks with new skills, with new ideas, with new theories, increase the publication rate. In terms of absorptive capacity, how well do you know those individuals' expertise? How well can you integrate them into your existing network? That has an effect of increasing the grant dollars awarded, right? So again, coming up with this idea that if we bring these individuals in, it's really helpful to have some sense of what their skills and expertise are so we know how to combine them in ways to think about pushing the field forward. And regardless of strategy, if you brought more collaborative resources into your network, both your quantity and quality of science production went up. So even those who were exploiting, if they could exploit to do and engage in more activities with their existing alters or to acquire more resources through those alters, they saw gains in production quantity and quality. And those who were exploring the same thing as well. So all that to say, right, is that there are costs and benefits associated with these different strategies, right? One takes advantage of known processes, existing competencies, established norms of engagement and reciprocity within your network, and perhaps lower coordination and transaction costs because we are maintaining our existing core set of network members. The exploration strategy increases those transactions and coordination costs. It's a more risky play, but it holds some promise that the work that you're going to do might be more innovative or lead to a particular discovery. But again, that's going to be a bit more distance, right? Perhaps uncertain, right? And so these costs and benefits are going to be important when we begin thinking more about the role of these institutional rules in shaping the types of networks that scientists are forming in and engaged in. And so that's what I want to talk to us now, that layered on top of these relationships and these networks and these evolutions are these contested resources frameworks, right? These new institutional rules and regulations that guide scientists' ability to exchange material and exchange resources, right? So it goes without saying, but I should start off with saying that access to and exchange of these biological materials is critical for science, right? You need to have a diverse range of genetic material, genetic resources in order to produce new crops that are climate resistant, new plants that can deal with particular pests. I was actually on my way driving to Northwestern this morning. I was listening to an NPR talk, and the guy was referencing the opioid epidemic. And one of the problems with opioids is they are this sort of blunt tool used to reduce pain, but it also hits on a bunch of other receptors associated with mood and other things as well. And so what they're finding is that they found some enzymes in the sort of venom of a snail that is being used to produce a new drug that holds some promise for combating pain relief without any of these sort of negative side effects, right? So a lot of the material that these scientists need come from a variety of sources that don't exist within the national borders of the country in which they work in, right? And the vast majority of these exchanges, where they get their material from, or they get different seeds or germplasm or plants or microbes from, it comes from other scientists, right? Research has suggested up to 80% or more of these exchanges of material between scientists come from other individuals, right? So these networks, these material sharing networks, are hugely important, right? But there's a growing number of rules and regulations that restrict the ability to access and exchange those materials. They put new ownership rights on them. So at the international level, there are things like the Nagoya Protocol or the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. At the US level, you have fish and wildlife. There's a whole bunch of different rules and regulations that are being layered on top of these exchanges, and they're no longer solely in control of the individual scientists. And these rules actually have significant teeth to them. In certain countries, you can be fined up to $50,000 for not following these rules and regulations. You can be put in jail. You can be kicked out of your university. And so there are serious transaction costs associated with trying to understand what these rules mean and how you engage others in exchanging material. And so for us, we were really interested in, well, how are scientists responding to this? As these rules grow in their complexity and the number, and they're restricting access and movement of materials, how are they responding to this? What are they doing? And how might these new rules affect their collaboration structures? How might they be churning their networks different, or thinking about maintaining particular ties to their network in a different way, given this new institutional environment? And some data we collected from a project with the USAID. We were looking at their innovation labs, and there are sort of 19 labs that are US-led that focus on a bunch of different crops, genetic resources for food and agriculture, sort of global networks. And we found there's serious effects of these rules and regulations, right? Most of them said they delayed their research project because they couldn't access material that they needed. Many of them changed the collaborators they work with, right? Again, thinking about this idea of churn. Many of them changed the countries that they are working with, right? So these are having huge implications on science as we unroll these new types of rules and regulations. And in terms of transaction costs, right, there are restrictions on transferring this material to other parties. So even if your colleague was able to maintain this material from Brazil, he can't just hand you that particular material. There's these restrictions on transfers to other parties, right? There's restrictions on commercial use or for profit use. A bunch of non-disclosure agreements have to be filed. So there's serious transaction costs that occur when you're obtaining this material now. And I think the important thing to kind of see here, maybe from the big picture, is you really have this decoupling of formal and informal institutions, right? So if you think about the traditional norms of science, it was really an open science, that scientists were free to exchange these materials with one another, and that the sort of biological and genetic diversity that existed on this planet was for the benefit of mankind, and that we should be able to exchange those resources freely with one another. And you see there's been this greater push for openness with regard especially to data. I think it was the 2012 G8 summit had a goal of sort of promoting open science, open data, sharing of information with one another. In 2013, Barack Obama made an executive order for machine-readable data to be the new norm for how governments operate. That has trickled down to state governments and local governments as well, right? So you have this informal norm that's in some places being codified about open science, and at the same time, you have this growing commercialization and these institutions that are creating ownership rights on the material itself. Right? So you have these sort of decoupling of both formal and informal institutions here that scientists need to operate within. Right? And Christine Oliver in particular has spent some time thinking about how people navigate these competing logics. Her work was in thinking about firms, but what we realized is that actors, they don't become passive, right? They operate strategically in trying to deal with these competing logics that they are surrounded by, right? And they want to try to figure out a way to continue with their work, their core tasks and functions, despite these competing logics. And so we wanted to study that. We wanted to study, well, what are these scientists doing? How are they responding to these new rules and regulations? And so we did a sort of pilot survey, this kind of semi-structured survey that was going to lead into this data that I'll talk about in a second. But we wanted to talk to scientists who work with genetic resources around the globe. And we were thinking about this in the context of Oliver's work and the strategies that people might pursue to deal with these sort of decoupling of formal and informal institutions. And we should say that these strategies that they engage in, which I'll mention in a second, are not mutually exclusive, that scientists involved with multiple of them, depending on the type of material they needed, what country they were working in, how closely they were connected with a given collaborator. And so we took this sample. It was kind of a 2x4 approach to thinking about this. We spoke with individuals in marine biology, entomology, agriculture, and ecology, and both folks who worked on genomics, thinking about sort of DNA strands, but also others who did more lab experiments or worked with live samples or specimens as well. We want to get a wide range of individuals who might be working with genetic material and data across the U.S. And here are all of our strategic responses, right? There's acquiescence, compromise, avoidance, defiance, and manipulation of these institutional rules and regulations that exist. I don't want to go through all of these, but I did want to highlight the last three because you can see that there are clear implications for networks, for how people design and think about their networks when they're faced with these rules and regulations. All right. So when you think about what an avoidance strategy would look like, well, this material exchanges have become more contested, and so people might simply attempt to avoid those regulations. They might shift their work to another area that makes their life easier to gather those materials, or to another scientist for which those transaction costs are lower. And here's a quote from one of the individuals. They said, "These are countries I simply will not do any work with anymore. I don't do field work anymore for a variety of reasons. Permitting is a big part of it." At one point, I was going to start a project looking at similar questions in fish, and so I started doing all of that stuff, and definitely the burden of paperwork that was required to get that stuff off the ground meant that it was just never got off the ground. I was like, oh, this is not worth it. Another person said, and then we found out they didn't want us to take anything, like anything at all. So any organism I isolated, any material we collected, would have to stay in country. And so that's a turnoff, right? I was scared away just because the process of getting the permit was so cumbersome. I didn't bother. I just gave up before too long. People are changing their research, changing how they conduct and where they conduct their work because of these rules and regulations. Some people outright sort of defied what these rules were, right? They disguised what they were shipping to their colleagues or their friends, or they would trade off material at a conference with one another, right? And because these are unethical activities, the amount of reporting that we heard in these surveys might actually be well underreported, but we did hear quite a bit of it, quite a lot of examples of people sort of defying these new rules and regulations. And some would sort of rationalize it to themselves by saying, well, I'm not carrying anything toxigenic. It's very hard for me to imagine that any harm would come from these materials if they ever got released out into the environment. Others say, I understand that there should be regulations for this kind of stuff, but the problem is that in many cases, as we have experienced, even if you try to do it all the legal way, it does not get done. And so you either kind of check down, you know my work, or I'm going to just go through the back door. Others say, I would go meet one of my buddies in some location and essentially just look the other way. Right? So again, here's this kind of idea of this strong tie, these networks that are going to be really important in sort of skirting these formal rules and regulations. Right? You can rely on your existing networks to try to reduce the burden and costs associated with accessing material if you have these trusting ties and trusting relationships between two individuals. Right? And lastly, folks talked about manipulation, right? And not always in a negative connotation. They were thinking about opportunities for which they could avoid the rules, sometimes within the existing legal framework. All right? They talked about how there's maybe only one person in this entire country or in this entire location that has ever gone through this process before. Right? You just have to sit down with this person and work with them directly to try to figure out how you can move ahead. Others say, well, you know what we did? We just deposited this material in a museum. Instead of shipping it between one another, we put it in the museum that is under a different set of rules and regulations, and then that work can then come out of the museum directly to us, right? So we didn't have to experience this major delay. We would just kind of avoid these rules a little bit by going through a local museum, okay? Others said, for this particular Hungarian permit, the main collaborator did all the collecting. He was always there. So that's how I believe that we can collect on his permit, because it's his permit. He's collecting the organisms. We're just assisting him in the field. So this idea of piggybacking, we heard a lot, that one person would go through the paperwork to try to get the permit needed to access this material, and others would just kind of work off that permit rather than getting it themselves. There's like signs of kind of manipulating it to try to work and maintain your research objectives, okay? So there are these rules, there are these restrictions. In this data that I'm going to talk to you about, we ended up surveying about 1,300 individuals responded. Only 11 said the rules and regulations had decreased slightly or had decreased at all, right? So these are increasingly significant burdens placed on these individuals who are trying to access these materials for their research. And so this contested resource framework really connects these ideas together about institutions, right? Trying to figure out the mechanisms through which these new institutions are shaping parameters of choice, right? How are these individual scientists deciding where they get their material from, which collaborators that they engage with, all right? And bringing these individuals in, giving them some agency in how they shape their own networks. It's not simply that these networks are self-forming, it's not simply that these institutions are creating rules by which they abide, but there is some individual agency associated with how they perceive these costs and how that then shapes their networks, right? And that connects back up with this concept of tie churn. So we started thinking about this with regard to transaction cost theory, right? And so transaction cost, the work of Coase and Williamson really helps us understand the boundaries of the firm, right? So when firms are trying to decide whether or not they should reach out to the market to obtain needed material and goods, or whether they should vertically integrate to produce them, they're considering these different sets of transaction costs, right? And we can think about the scientists as facing similar problems, right? Do they go obtain the material for themselves in these countries, or do they rely on some other individual to engage in some arm's length or market negotiation to get that material from them, right? So you can think about this sort of make or buy idea that the scientists are facing within this transaction cost framework. In the mid-80s, Granovetter had this famous critique of transaction cost theory. He said, hey, you guys are ignoring everything we know about social networks and this sort of embeddedness in networks, that we really want to understand how people are making these decisions about how to access material resources that they need. You need to think about the social networks that they are embedded in. And then to this discussion, in the 90s, you had a bunch of sociologists saying, well, we need to start thinking about not just markets and hierarchies and the networks people are embedded in, but thinking about networks as a distinct form of organizing that has its own sort of norms of reciprocity and trust and committedness, and this kind of is a distinct way by which we can operate. Right? And within this sort of literature of thinking about networks, we can think about social exchange theory, and that individuals are really engaged in two types of exchanges, right? One, which is more this sort of market exchange, this arm's length exchange, referred to as negotiated exchanges, right? These are joint, explicit bargaining at the time of the exchange for simultaneous benefit. You might provide me this material, I'm going to provide you some monetary or non-monetary return, maybe the results of my research, but these are really arm's length negotiations for the exchange of material. You don't have any other access to this person, you don't engage in them in other ways, you don't collaborate with them, and you can really think about this as a typical market transaction. The other are these sort of reciprocal exchanges, right? These are non-negotiated, right? There's some outstanding obligation, there's some benefit in the future that I'm going to provide to you by giving me the receipt of that material today, right? And so these are how often long-term relationships exist, right? And build social capital because you have these non-negotiated exchanges that I'm indebted to you or you indebted to me at any given particular point in time, and because of that we maintain this relationship because of the mutual benefit and reciprocity that is built in. And so the idea is that some of these scientists might be sticking here with their tight collaborative network to gain the material, but some they might reach out to these non-collaboratives, these sort of arm's length negotiations that are a bit removed from their particular network. And what we're interested in trying to understand is, well, how do these different transaction costs and these social costs influence whether or not these scientists intend to dissolve those ties, right? To turn over those particular ties in their network. And so when we combine this idea and we're thinking of a sort of theory of network churn, we can think of two particular types of costs that these scientists might be confronted with. One are these social exchange costs, right? These, again, come through expectations of reciprocity, or this norm that I'm going to repay whatever benefit you are giving me today, right? And so historically, there weren't really any transaction costs of exchanging material. It was sort of the wild, wild west. If you needed something, I would just hand it to you, or I would mail it to you, right? And so what was a part of the cost of those exchanges were really just these social exchange costs. What did I owe you? Was I going to bring on one of your students? Was I going to write a publication with you? Was I going to give you credit for some of this particular work? What were these social exchange costs that were embedded in that particular trade? And now with these new rules and regulations, there's a greater extent of exchange transaction costs, right? The contracts we have to write up, how we're going to coordinate this exchange, what are the different rules and policies that we need to follow, what are my obligations, what do I need to directly return to you at the time of receipt of this particular material, right? So there's these two distinct types of costs that one might confront, and they may be more or less pronounced given the type of tie that the material flows over, whether it's this sort of negotiated arm's length tie, or whether it is this more reciprocal sort of collaborative tie that is involved in the exchange of the material. So this is some data we actually just finished collecting and cleaning a couple weeks ago. This is a national survey of scientists in ecology, entomology, and marine biology, marine sciences, at all U.S. institutions that were labeled very high or high. Right? So these are Research 1 institutions in the U.S. Collected a bunch of personal network data, obviously a bunch of name generators. We got who their closest collaborators were, both within the U.S. and outside of the U.S. For those collaborators, we asked them who they exchanged material with, who they exchanged data with. And we also asked them outside of these collaborators, who else do you go to for material? Who else do you get your data from? And a whole bunch of interpreters about who these people were and the cost of different exchanges associated with those alters. We had about 1,300 responses to our sample, and 814 of those were current material users. They had existing material exchange networks. Most of these networks were about 4 or 5 people associated in them. So we had a large number of these folks are actively using material, actively seeking material, constantly looking to get new, diverse genetic resources for their research. And so some of our hypotheses, one was focused on this sort of institutional level, right? Thinking about these new rules and regulations. What do they do? It really creates environmental uncertainty, right? It really creates some concern over whether or not this exchange is really going to happen, whether or not that material is ever going to be able to leave that particular country, right? And it also creates this higher transaction costs. We need to negotiate the contracts. We need these sort of use agreements with one another. And so we asked the scientists a question simply about, well, how extensive are these rules and regulations and administrative processes that govern your research? And so we simply hypothesized that, hey, those who perceive these greater transaction costs, these greater extent to which these rules and regulations govern the research, are going to be more likely to leave their existing relationships. They're going to be more likely to say, I'm going to dissolve this tie in the future, right? Because it's costly to maintain. On the network side, we really focused on these strong ties. And I think the example that we heard from the qualitative interviews where the individual said, oh, I just go and meet my buddy at this particular location and we just exchange this genetic material, right, sort of off the records, is a real indication of the role of these strong ties in material exchange, right? And what we know from strong ties is that they reduce transaction costs, right? There's less monitoring that needs to go on, there's less negotiation and coordination that needs to occur, right? And so people might be really wedded to these strong ties because it can help them reduce the transaction costs they're facing when they're trying to obtain the genetic material and resources that they need for their research. So we kind of had 2 hypotheses here. One, that the strong ties, thinking about friendship and frequency of communication, is going to decrease the likelihood that ego leaves that relationship, that the respondent says, hey, I plan on dissolving this tie in the future. And then embeddedness, thinking about multiple forms of collaboration. Do we write articles together? Do we write grants together? Or is this strictly an arm's length negotiation for material? But these embedded ties are going to decrease the likelihood that ego was going to leave that relationship in the future. At the dyadic level, again, we're thinking about those 2 types of costs, right? There are these social exchange costs in terms of these expectations of reciprocity, right? What are you going to get provided with in the future for an exchange of a good now? And so one of the things that we asked them is, for every single dyadic relationship they had mentioned, for every single alter, we asked them this balance of exchange question. We said, on balance, over time, that you have known these people, have you provided more valuable resources to them, or have they provided more to you? Like, what is the balance of trade in this relationship that you have with this individual? Simply because we assume that egos who perceive that they give more than is returned by an alter, they're going to be more likely to leave that particular relationship in the future. We were also interested in these transaction costs, the ones that come from more negotiated exchanges. We were thinking about this in terms of uncertainty, which I'll mention in a second, but also complexity, right? So we asked them, on average, how simple or complex is the process to request biological materials from these people? So for every single alter in their material exchange network, they provided a sense of the complexity of the negotiations that had to occur for them to obtain that material from the individual. Again, thinking back to the transaction costs, that as those increase, as it becomes more complex for me to work with you to get this material, the likelihood of me leaving this relationship is going to increase as well. And then there's the contingent effects, right? We make this clear distinction between negotiated exchanges and reciprocal exchanges, right? But both of these types of exchanges, and all types of social exchanges, have risks associated with them. But the risks are different for negotiated exchanges versus reciprocal exchanges, right? So if you think about a classic sort of market negotiated exchange, what is the real risk, right? Well, the real risk is in failing to make an agreement with your partner, right? In failing to obtain the material that you are working with them to obtain. So we have this hypothesis that effect of uncertainty, the effect of how likely it is that you might get that material from that particular alter, that effect of uncertainty is going to be greater in negotiated exchanges. So we can create this sort of interaction between alters who simply provide me material. They're just this sort of market exchange partner, and the importance of uncertainty of the exchange on whether or not I plan to leave this relationship in the future. And for reciprocal exchanges, what is the key risk? Well, the key risk is that your benefits are not returned, right? That your goodwill or the value that you provide to that relationship is not reciprocated back to you, right? And so, again, we think about an interaction here, that this balance of trade, this idea of reciprocity, is going to be more important for your collaborator networks, more than your material providers only, right? So if it's just an individual that I engage in a negotiated exchange with, I'm less concerned about reciprocity, right? We bargain for everything at the time of the exchange, and so the idea of this reciprocity might have less meaning and be less important for my material exchange relations, right? So we wanted to make this distinction about how these costs are going to affect these particular types of ties in your material exchange networks, right? So these actors have both these more strong ties, collaborative relations that exchange material, and they have these more arm's length sort of market ties that exchange material. And these costs are likely to be different for both of those types of relations. So what we have here is really this multi-level model. You have a bunch of alters nested within their egos. So we can run a sort of random effects model to control for that nesting of alters within egos. And our dependent variable here is the intent to leave this relationship. So we got a bunch of information about all of these alters in each of these scientist networks, whether they're senior to them, if they are in the US, what sort of location they are in the world, how often they communicate. There's questions of balance of exchange and gender, a whole bunch of attributes of these individuals. And we really want to know, for each of these ties, information about the transaction costs that are associated with this tie to obtain material, social exchange costs, and for us, thinking of tie churn, the likelihood that you dissolve that tie in the future. Right? So this is the individual's perception that they plan to leave this tie. And this actually has some limitations in a way because it's just cross-sectional. We're asking them, do they intend to leave this tie? But it's actually really important in thinking about individual agency, because most of the time, we just observe a tie as present or absent. And the question is, when that tie became absent, who was driving it? Was it the ego or was it the alter that led to the dissolution of that particular tie? We never really know, whether it's through bibliometric data or standard survey data that has been collected. But here, kind of borrowing from the organizational literature about individuals' intent to leave an organization, we're asking them about their intent to sort of disengage from this particular relationship, right? And so you can imagine that this gives you a little bit of additional leverage because you understand why the individual is choosing to end that tie rather than just seeing the tie itself end, right? And I should say, beyond bibliometric data, which simply tells us who is publishing with who, this gives us this whole wealth of additional information. These are collaborators that you write patents with, or you might just get advice from, you might write grants with, but never really show up on this sort of bibliometric publication information. So this is the data, and this is what we're thinking about, whether the likelihood that you're going to dissolve or cancel this particular tie. So what do we find? Well, we found that these institutions really matter. If you claimed that the rules and regulations that you face are more extensive, we had this sort of Likert scale, so a 1 unit increase in the extensiveness of these rules and regulations meant you're almost 1.5 times more likely to say you're going to dissolve a tie, right? So egos who face larger institutional constraints, these rules and regulations, are much more likely to begin churning their networks over, right? There's just more cost that they're facing and embedded in these particular networks. For the strong ties, we found no significant effect of friendship, right? So if you were friends with this individual, it didn't change how likely you were or not to dissolve that particular tie, but increase in communication frequency reduced the likelihood by nearly 70%. So someone you're interacting with quite frequently, a good indicator of a strong tie relation, much less likely to dissolve that tie. Something I haven't been able to wrap my head around yet, kind of had different theories about why this may be, but if you collaborate with that individual on an article, again thinking of embedded ties, but if we collaborate on an article, it nearly doubled the likelihood of me leaving, but if we collaborated on a grant, it reduced the likelihood of leaving by 45%. All right? We've had some different ways of thinking about why this may be, but I also think that Duncan Lofts has this book that says everything is obvious once you know the answer, and so once you see these results, you can begin sort of hypothesizing or theorizing why this may be. It's kind of interesting to see that these things are moving in opposite directions, and oftentimes we think about collaboration and, well, you work together on grants and articles. This appears to have a very different effect on least the churning of certain ties in networks. In terms of these exchange costs that we were talking about, the first, again, was thinking about these social exchange costs, which are embedded in these reciprocal relationships. What we found is that the ego is 3.5 times more likely to leave a relationship if they give more than they receive. Right? So if they sense that the risk is inherent, that they're not getting enough benefit, much more likely to intend to leave that relationship, perhaps not surprisingly. But on the transaction cost side, we found a positive but not significant effect for those transaction costs, the complexity of the exchange that had to occur. And for those contingent effects, again, we were thinking that the effect of uncertainty was going to be larger for negotiated relations. So again, the arm's length relationships that I'm forming to gain this material, the key sort of risk factor there is the uncertainty that I'm going to be able to obtain that material. Regardless of all the time I spent filling out the paperwork and filling out these forms, there still might be hiccups that don't allow that material to reach me. So what is the uncertainty by which I think that the material will, that I'll be able to maintain that material? And our belief was that that effect was going to be larger for negotiated exchange relationships. So what we found, though, is ego is 55% less likely to leave if a relationship was more certain, right? We're going to stick with those certain ties. But there was no sense that there was any interaction at all, that we weren't differentiating between negotiated versus reciprocal exchange in terms of the importance of uncertainty, right? Uncertainty was important regardless of whether it was a more collaborative tie or if it was a more arm's length sort of market connection, which was really interesting to us at that point. And we found no interaction effect for the balance of trade either, which again is interesting, right? They're not seeing these relationships as differentiated in any way, these negotiated versus reciprocal relations. So maybe a couple quick comments here, just a way of a conclusion. One is that control over these resources has shifted from scientists to institutions, right? That they are less in control over the movement and access to these materials, and that there are greater institutions at the national and international level that place restrictions on their ability to access genetic resources and material for their research. That these institutional rules and regulations are leading to greater turnover in scientific networks, right? These folks are nearly 1.5 times more likely to leave these relationships, and that was the same for both reciprocated and negotiated exchange ties. Both social costs in terms of balance of trade, right? This idea of reciprocity and the balance of trade in my network ties was an important predictor of churn. And transaction costs in terms of uncertainty was an important predictor of tie, but not in terms of the complexity of the transaction itself. And so for us, what I think is kind of important, or what we're kind of pondering over now, is that despite the literature that stresses this distinction between reciprocal exchange and negotiated exchange, we're not seeing that the scientists aren't responding in different ways to these two types of ties that they have in their particular network. There's little evidence that they're treating them differently, that these transaction costs and these social exchange costs that should be pronounced in one form of relationship over the other isn't there. Right? And what this may mean is that scientists in the future may simply have less collaborative resources available to them, that they're churning ties over that are both market and collaborative without thinking about the additional sort of benefit that might come from these collaborative, from these strong ties, which we find to be interesting, that these effects of the transaction costs are sort of equally important for both those types of transactions. And so in the future research, we're working to collect an additional wave of data to kind of follow up with these scientists to see what has actually happened in their networks, how they have evolved, how they've been dealing with these transaction costs. We're thinking about better ways to measure things that are quite difficult to capture through a survey, these sort of social exchange and transaction costs. We're going to combine this with some bibliometric data, perhaps over time, to look at how these perceptions of these costs are linking up with collaboration over time. And then thinking more broadly about these network strategies, these formal institutions, how those things interact to affect science production in the long term. Right? How can we design these new institutional rules and regulations in a way that provide for appropriate access, but also benefit sharing for the countries who own that genetic resource or that exists within their sovereign land. A couple quick acknowledgments. Two key collaborators down at Arizona State University, Eric Welsh and Mary Feeney, and a bunch of funding has come in through the USAID, International Food Policy Research Institute, and the National Science Foundation as well, which we're hoping to continue these sort of relationships to kind of push this research further, because we think it has really important policy implications on science production and innovation, especially within food and agriculture, and also theoretical implications, thinking about these transaction costs and social exchange costs and these different types of networks and the role of institutions in shaping individuals' decisions about their networks. So I'd be happy to take any questions or follow up with you guys on questions about the data if I don't have answers here with me today.
So we have a few minutes left, everybody.
Yeah.
So, excuse me. So, in part one, something I was interested in with the basically, could you just say more about how like the demographics of the scientists may affect some of their like productivity or their exploration and exploitation behavior? So, someone pre-tenure versus a very senior scholar with respect to their decisions to explore or exploit. Or even like along gender lines, if you have data there, or disciplinary boundaries.
Yeah, so a lot of the original data suggests that women's networks tended to be smaller and less dense. We didn't really find that the women's networks were sort of just as large. One of the things that they have been finding is that women tend to seek out more advice relationships, how to balance work life, how to navigate some of the minefields that confront them sort of in the tenure process, and male tend to have more collaborative resources, people that they're writing grants with or they're writing articles with. And so that distinction has some implications for productivity along those gender lines. And if I recall in terms of rank, that the junior scientists had the more exploratory strategies, right? Which kind of makes sense. You're moving to a new institution, you're probably trying to find these collaborators that you want to work with moving into the future. And as you moved up in those ranks, you kind of found those individuals and you sort of stuck with them. Right, and so those networks often became a little bit smaller, a little bit denser for more senior members of those fields. Yeah, but yeah, interesting dynamics between them. And there's some papers that my colleagues have written just looking at the sort of descriptives and how these things unfold and the role of, or especially the role of gender in science production.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I was curious, looking or seeing like both studies. Are you interested, or are you planning on looking at how changes in institutional policy affect people's explorative versus exploitative behaviors in their networks, or have you been observing that at all yet?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the things that we really want to do, and we have some data where we know every altar's location, and we know the type of material they are exchanging, so we can actually try to understand the exact rules and regulations that are confronting them, rather than just my perception of how extensive they are, how complex they are. We've asked them, in this last survey that I mentioned, we asked them a bunch of questions about what's required to exchange the material, like transfer agreements, monetary payments. We know some of that stuff, but we really would like to begin tracking at a national level what these particular rules and regulations are, and how that might be shaping scientists' particular decision about altars within given countries. Like Brazil is notorious for being super difficult to get material out of. India as well, and other countries are sort of more open and trying to bring capacity in by allowing scientists to come and set up labs there or work with their local population. So I think it's going to be huge, thinking about how these different scientists are implementing these different protocols that they are signing on to. I think 92 countries have signed on to this Nagoya protocol, which creates these access and benefit sharings, but they implement it in a variety of different ways, and they have different restrictions and penalties for not abiding by those rules. And so that was just in 2010, and I think 2014 was really just getting off the ground. So we're going to really learn a lot about how this is affecting science, I think, in the coming years. But to answer that sort of exact question, how are the sort of changes or implementation of these rules in different countries really affecting sort of collaboration or productivity?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
So in study one, I'm wondering what is the best time interval between Taiwan time to better understand the actual churn, network churn to predict the outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a good answer for thinking about what is the appropriate timescale to see how networks are evolving. For us, it was a sort of like 2 to 2.5 year period.
Two and a half?
Yeah, in the first study, we waited 2.5 years before collecting data again. One of the things that might be interesting to do is actually just collect some bibliometric data to see when you see real breaks in people's networks over time. But yeah, for us, we're thinking about the sort of length of a lot of grants. We're sort of 2 to 3 years. So if we're capturing people there, they might be seeing that that turnover in that time frame. But yeah, I don't have a good sense of what is the ideal sense of which you would see these ties turning over, right? And there's also this notion of dormant ties. Just because I'm not collaborating with you now doesn't mean that I won't in the future. But I've disengaged with you at least in this last 2-year period for whatever reasons, transaction costs, social change costs, moving in opposite directions, right? But yeah, that's another thing to think about. What is that sort of right timescale at which you begin making claims that these networks have actually churned in a particular way?
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you have like a third wave of data, so will that change the results or not?
Yeah. No, we don't have a third wave of data, which is partly why we want to link this stuff up to some bibliometrics and you can kind of pair those up and then look at longer term changes in network structures.
So I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. But before we go, on behalf of Sonic and Nashir, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
It's a Sonic pen. And so please join me in thanking Professor Siciliano. On your way out, if you're interested in some of our other speakers, we have the schedule there. Please note that since the last talk, we've added one more speaker to our schedule, Professor Johan Gonder. So that'll be in February. So thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Not just on the live stream now. Normally it's so
Yes,
or,
sir.
so I have others policies. But sometimes they're not sorry, more like Google with it. This has a lot. It's great. So next on the schedule, we have a couple meetings before lunch. Just grad students.
Okay.
Maybe. Are you
Yeah,
meeting
I can
after
just
lunch?
want to say hi and we will have lunch together.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah,
great.
You know, and Lisa, we have lunch at, I'll pick up,
We'll get
lunch at 11:55.
Okay, yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, sounds good.
Well, thank you, great
Yeah.
talk.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks for generous for coming. Please. So the first one sorry, the first one is published, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I will check online, social networks, right?
Yep.
Cool, awesome.
All right, thanks. I'll see you in a little bit.
I see.
So do you need a few minutes of a break?
I'm good, whatever the plan
So
is.
this is
Okay,
online.
so I think there's 2 meetings. We'll go back to the conference room.
Okay.
And then at noon, Wei and Yunu sitting over here will take you over to lunch. And I think that should be kind of a good
Sorry
break
if I
as
go
well.
to
That's a
Northwest.
long time.
Yeah, perfect.
So if you need time to
Yes.
relax during the day, just let me know and I'll, we can schedule it. The only one that we shouldn't really shift around is Professor Lewinsky. It's harder to schedule.
Yeah. No, it's great. Yeah, it's totally good.
Okay, well let's head back to the conference room then.
Yeah.
Well,
Zach?
Yeah, if you're not able to find a specific link, you can email